Well, if they did fall on deaf ears, but it's just the latest example in the really day by day, the deepening trade war that is underway between the United States and China. Yes, we are learning that U.S. officials privately behind the scenes urged China to not retaliate. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been saying that publicly all along, warning countries to not retaliate. Well, those warnings have fallen on deaf ears, particularly with China, as they raise their tariffs to 125%. The question now is which side is going to blink?
In recent weeks, the world has been experiencing a cataclysm in the global economy. It all started when China made a move that shook the entire financial world. For the first time in history, China has integrated its digital currency into the international settlement system, covering 10 countries in Southeast Asia and 6 countries in the Middle East. This decision opens the door to nearly 40% of global trade, which can now bypass the SWIFT system, a financial fortress created by the US. But what does this mean for us?
Right now, 145 going up against 125. These are the tariffs between the world's 2 biggest economies.
And here's another number, 4,700, or about $400 per month. That is how much more money Yale's now estimating, the Yale Budget Lab, that President Trump's tariffs are going to cost average households each year. And with just hours left in trading, the Dow right now.
Beijing has 2 key goals: to create a financial network independent of the West and to become a central player in global trade, avoiding the risks associated with dollar fluctuations and economic sanctions. More importantly, the move came just after Donald Trump imposed new tariffs on Chinese goods. China, as always, retaliated with a punch.
We shouldn't be surprised with all that's coming out and all the worries about tariffs. It's not just that, it's the complexity of everything else as well. The changes within the federal government, the worries about job losses, the worries about a slowing economy, higher inflation, and eventually you get these what's known as soft data.
But this is just the tip of the iceberg. China no longer relies on Western technology. Its response to US pressure is to completely cut off cooperation with the world's biggest technology giants, such as ASML and SMIC. For years, these companies supplied China with key components for semiconductor manufacturing, but in response to the US ban, the Chinese have decided not just to walk away, they are creating their own technologies. 10 years ago, this seemed impossible. Today, China is already producing its own chips capable of competing with the world's best. And that's not just an answer, it's the beginning of a new era in the global technology industry.
In other words, pre-substitution, if we just continue as we are now. But of course, people will start to substitute. They will find other goods. And as the Christmas Tree Association said a moment or 2 ago, it's going to be very difficult to find substitution of many things that we currently get from China.
But all of this has not come without consequences. China has not just stopped buying from ASML and SMIC, but has begun to destroy US assets in the stock markets. What does this mean for us? This is not just a fight over technology. This is a true war of currencies and investments, where the stakes are getting higher by the day.
Up. You're seeing that swing here going into the afternoon, up almost 650 points. But it was up and down there throughout earlier in the day. With us now, we have CNN business editor-at-large Richard Quest. We have CNN chief national security analyst Jim Sciutto as well. Richard, a key economic gauge, the consumer sentiment now at its second lowest level on record, going back to 1952. Why?
And that's where the fun part comes in. This is not just an economic battle between 2 great powers. China, using its resources and strategy, has already started to work with those countries that were once allies of the US. At this time, financial markets have begun to collapse and entire industries, including technology, are on the verge of collapse. How does this affect our wallet? Why can soaring tariffs on goods from China and falling stock markets affect everyone from retirees to those just starting to invest? All these events are just the beginning of the most serious economic crisis of the new century. The question is, how will we react to it? And are we prepared for the consequences this global economic rift will bring? Stay tuned to find out what happens next and how you can prepare for this financial storm.
The Chinese impression is that they are willing to at least negotiate, not necessarily on Donald Trump's terms, but to talk. But their impression is that the U.S. has not opened channels and not made an effort to open up channels.
The world of economics has been undergoing epochal changes recently. In April 2025, China made a move that is historic and has global implications. This is not just a change in financial flows, but an entire spiral that has the potential to change not only the economy, but also the political landscape on a global level. China has integrated its digital currency, the yuan, into the international payment systems of 10 countries in Southeast Asia and 6 countries in the Middle East. This is not just a financial innovation, but a real attack on the established global settlement system based on the US dollar. Now, almost 40% of global trade turnover can bypass the SWIFT system, which, in fact, is a symbol of US power in the international arena.
Yeah, you'll be surprised just how much we get exclusively from China. And Jim, I'm really curious to get your perspective on the White House's handling of this situation. Not so much the tariffs that have been announced, but this reporting that the White House, that officials have made clear to Beijing that they want Xi to ask for a call with Trump.
For world finance, this came as a real shock. Numerous experts, including those who are not prone to panic, now believe that this event was a turning point in the global financial architecture. Until recently, the dollar remained the world's reserve asset, and all countries, including the US, were bound by this system. Now, with the introduction of the digital yuan, China is creating an alternative that has the potential to weaken the West's power over global markets. Whereas the US was the sole center of global financial settlement, China is now building a new center before the eyes of the world that is projected to grow in power over the next decades. Far from a mere currency change or temporary political intrigue, this is a genuine economic maneuver that poses a danger to the dollar as the world's currency.
To allow that. So now you have the U.S. president say, well, I'm not going to open those channels. China has to open them first. It's kind of ridiculous at the end of the day because you are playing with the interests of American consumers, Chinese consumers, etc. The other point I would make about China's reaction today in not quite meeting the U.S. tariffs, 145% U.S., China goes to 125. And in Xi's statement, he says, we're going to 125 in response. That's as high as we're going because this is getting a little ridiculous, right? And that's both a signal to say we're not going to get caught up in this tit for tat to the degree that the president is.
This move by Beijing is not an accident, nor is it the result of internal tensions. Everything that is happening is the result of a long and carefully considered strategy. China has long realized that its dependence on the dollar and on the US financial system as a whole limits its opportunities. In recent years, China has invested heavily in developing its own technology and infrastructure and has become more and more independent of Western countries every year. Abandoning the dollar and entering a new financial era is not a random act, but a logical continuation of its policy. Beijing aims to create a financial network that will be independent of the West, and that will allow China not only to strengthen its economy, but also to significantly change the rules of world trade. This point has become particularly important after the US decided to apply tough economic measures against China, including new tariffs and sanctions, which greatly infringe on China's freedom of maneuver in international markets.
Lived in China, you've covered China for some time now. As we're looking at this question of who's going to blink first, with two very different political systems, what is your gauge on this?
Well, different systems, listen, one's a democracy, one is not. One's a single-party state, very much not a democracy. But China does have politics, and Chinese leaders do not want to be seen, we were talking about this yesterday, I believe, do not want to be seen as capitulating to America. That is not good politics for a Chinese leader.
In this context, China's actions become even more justified. Beijing's objective is no longer simply to fight US sanctions, but to create an economic bloc that will rely on its own financial mechanisms. In this sense, China's steps are not only aimed at eliminating external threats, but also at creating a strategic advantage in the long term. In particular, Beijing expects that with the help of the digital yuan, it will be able to bypass US financial sanctions and seize opportunities for more favorable economic deals. Experts believe that the introduction of the yuan into the settlement systems of Asian and Middle Eastern countries is only the beginning. In the future, China will expand the zones of application of its digital currency, which will significantly increase its role in global trade and become a real challenge to the United States. However, in addition to financial maneuvers, Beijing is also active in other areas. The fact that China has become the largest trading partner for ASEAN countries indicates its desire to create a network of economic alliances that would not depend on the US. China's trade with ASEAN reached nearly $1 trillion in 2022, a huge share of global trade volume. But these are not just numbers, they are a signal that China is no longer just an economy, but a global player capable of influencing the political and economic agenda. Notably, in this context, China is not only maintaining its influence in Asia, but is also actively expanding its position in the Middle East. In recent years, China has concluded a number of important agreements with Arab countries, which further strengthens its financial network.
There are surveys like the Michigan survey, consumer sentiment, and it's a really worrying number because at some point these sentiment surveys feed into hard data of real consumer spending, and we know this from history and precedent. That's what happens. So when we see a number as bad as this one, it is only a matter of time, unless anything else changes that would suddenly make people more cheerful. Look at that chart. I mean, just look at it. Unless people suddenly become more cheerful, why would this not translate into spending? You see, that consumer lab, the lab from Yale, that number of 4,700, that is providing you don't start substituting goods.
It is in this context that a moment came that shook the global market. Beijing not only introduced digital currency into the country's settlement systems, but also did so at a time when the Trump administration was intensifying trade sanctions against China. China's response was lightning fast and quite unexpected. In response to increased tariffs on Chinese goods, China decided to take a devastating step for the global technology industry, refusing to buy high-tech equipment from the world's leading manufacturers, ASML and TSMC. These companies used to supply China with the necessary technology for semiconductor production, and the cessation of these supplies was a real blow to the world's technology markets. It is noteworthy that this move by China was prepared long ago. In 2022, China began actively reforming its domestic semiconductor industry. The country invested more than $75 billion to develop its own chip-making technologies and recruited tens of thousands of engineers, many of whom worked at giants such as Huawei and Silicon Valley. 3 years later, China was already capable of producing its own semiconductors, with local factories producing components using 60 to 70% domestic raw materials and technology. This independence from Western supplies is fundamentally changing the balance of power in the market. But the biggest surprise is that China, despite all the efforts of the West, has already overcome many technological barriers. After all, not so long ago it was considered impossible to create chips capable of competing with those produced by Europe and the United States. However, the Chinese company SMIC now claims that it has successfully developed its own technology to produce chips with dimensions of 5 and even 3 nanometers. And these are not just words. Chinese chips are already in mass production, and their quality is not inferior to their Western counterparts. It is safe to say that China is now not just catching up with the world leaders in technology, but is beginning to outpace them, which promises radical changes in the global arena.
But it's also an opening to say, okay, we're capping this for now, and that perhaps offers a way forward that we could begin talking about how to bring these down.
However, the financial war that China has unleashed has its own risks. While Chinese analysts are confident in their strength and capabilities, experts from the US and Europe are beginning to say that in the long run, these maneuvers could lead to economic consequences that would be much more devastating than they seem at first glance. One such possible scenario concerns how global markets might perceive the abandonment of the dollar. Many central banks, realizing the possible consequences, have begun to consider replacing the dollar with other currencies, which poses a threat to the stability of the entire global financial system. In response, the US may increase its economic sanctions and implement new restrictions on Chinese goods and technology. And so, when China began to reshape its entire policy, the US responded not only with economic sanctions, but also with extremely harsh measures against key sectors of the Chinese economy. With the imposition of new tariffs on Chinese goods, Beijing found itself in a situation where it had to act tough and decisively. The Chinese response was instantaneous. Not only did it continue to develop its domestic technology, but it also began an active confrontation at the trade level with the US, starting with large-scale asset sales and moving to restrict rare earth exports. Now global markets are beginning to feel the consequences. If China can further advance its interests in global markets, its influence will only grow. This is not just a battle for technical leadership, it is a question of who will drive the world economy for the next decades. Especially since, in this process, it appears that China is not going to limit itself to trade relations with traditional allies. Countries in Asia, the Middle East, and even South America are beginning to feel China's influence and are becoming more and more economically dependent on Chinese capital every year. This new global economic order will not only give China the ability to manage the entire process, but will also create the conditions for the Chinese yuan to become the international reserve currency in a few years. This process will involve not only the economy, but also the political will of the countries supporting Beijing. Already now the country, according to many experts, is the largest trading partner for more than 30 countries around the world, and in the coming years this list will only grow. Thus, the struggle for leadership in the semiconductor market and the currency war that is developing before our eyes may become only a prelude to a global economic revolution. The most important question facing the world today is how will the relationship between the US and China develop in the coming years? Will China's ambitions to create an alternative to the dollar lead to a new economic reality, where China assumes the role of a leading player in the global financial system? Or will the West be able to turn the tide of this game? Time will tell. But one thing is certain, the global economy has entered a new phase, and its consequences will be felt for a long time to come. The global trade war between the US and China, having reached a critical point, has now entered a phase where the stakes are much higher than just tariffs and sanctions. Beijing has succeeded more than ever in jeopardizing not only America's economic supremacy, but also its financial stability. In response to measures aimed at curbing Chinese growth, Beijing has said it is ready for even more drastic steps, and things could now go in a very different direction. Tariffs, embargoes, and control over strategic resources are just the beginning of a new phase that threatens to turn into a long-term and profound economic disaster for countries that support the US. And while the trade war was once just a set of economic measures, it could now escalate into a global financial crisis. China has not only responded to the threats with new restrictions, but has also begun to actively use unconventional economic methods, such as fighting for control over rare earth metals. In recent months, Beijing has significantly increased its influence over the global rare earths market by completely controlling the supply of key materials that are essential for the production of high-tech goods, including smartphones, chips, and electric cars. This has directly hit US corporations that have been heavily dependent on these materials in recent times. Countries like the US and European Union countries that relied on supplies from China are now facing a shortage of rare earth materials and are forced to find alternatives. But this, according to experts, will cost them a significant amount of money, as Chinese materials have long been more price competitive and are virtually unrivaled in international markets. Suddenly, many Western countries have begun to realize that their dependence on China has gone beyond trade in goods and technology. If China continues on its course of using rare earth resources as a strategic weapon, the consequences for the US economy will be catastrophic. This is especially true for high-tech products that are so essential to the development of the world's largest economies. Against the backdrop of this confrontation, China began to impose sanctions against the US even more actively, especially in the field of high technology. Chinese enterprises have begun to limit the supply of key components for such giants as Intel and Nvidia, as well as to close access for American manufacturers to their own Chinese factories. All of this is putting unprecedented pressure on American industry. More importantly, China, sensing its victory, is beginning to increase its influence in European countries. When the US imposes sanctions, China becomes a defender of free trade for those countries that disagree with US policy. Already today, countries such as Germany and France are beginning to openly declare that they are ready to work with China on new terms, bypassing American financial structures. This will mean another wave of aggravation between the US and Europe, which could lead to the economic division of the world. But all this is just the beginning. The economic war could escalate into a currency crisis where China could use its digital currency, the yuan, as the main means of settlement between countries. Such a move could dramatically change the balance of the world economy, as countries that do not want to deal with the dollar would be able to switch to China's settlement systems. In this case, the dollar will no longer play the role of the main global medium of exchange, and this will hit the US financial markets hard. By this time, China is actively expanding its market position by incorporating countries in the Middle East, South America, and Africa into its currency system, which could lead to the creation of a new trading bloc that can effectively circumvent sanctions and dollar dominance. The move could be strategically decisive if Beijing can convince other countries to switch to the yuan as the basis of their settlements. In response, the US may be forced to take the most extreme measures. It is predicted that economic sanctions could be even tougher, and the fight against Chinese influence on the world stage could go beyond economic competition. It is possible that the US will impose new tariffs on Chinese goods, as well as attempt to block China's access to international financial markets. But the effectiveness of these measures in the face of growing Chinese influence is increasingly doubtful. Think about it. If the US fails to turn the tide, the world may be entering a new era where China will dictate the rules of the game. What will happen to the dollar? How will we be affected by the loss of US influence over world markets? And will other countries be able to adapt to this new reality? Or will the world find itself in a situation of economic crisis that will have long-term consequences for all countries? Time will tell, but one thing is certain: this conflict will be decisive for the future of the world economy.